various levels of seniority. Welcome everyone. Here we are in materia. One thing that makes panels such as these very interesting is having scholars in different points in the academic career, in the profession, different levels of seniority. I think it's fair to say that what we have with us today is the present and the future. I will not say the past, because there's no such thing, right? Of environmental humanities here today. Really distinguished and emerging speakers with us today. I'll say that Christian Galdón, beaming in from Paris, is a PhD in Latin American literature from Université de Paris 8, Vincennes Saint-Denis. He teaches at Paris 1, Sorbonne, Panthéon, and at the Lycée Henri IV. He was here recently also as a visiting scholar. We had him in person, so it's very special to have him back, at least online. He's also working with Alan Griego, our librarian, to bring the Daniel Sada archive, the Mexican modernist writer to Stanford. It's a really important strategic project for the development of our Latin American collections. David Stentiford holds a BA in Environmental Studies and Literature from Whitman College and an MA in English from the University of Nevada, Reno, where he studied literature and environment. There's a track there that's really famous, as some of you might know. For quite some time, David has been involved with environmental humanities, and he was instrumental, really, along with Vicky Gugation, who is going to come to Materia later in the year, for keeping the flame alive when we lost Uchihaise to the even greener pastures of Southern California. Mas Rosendahl Thompson teaches and researches world literature, post-humanism, and digital humanities. Of each of these fields, he is a foundational figure and inspiration for many. In September 2019, he edited a Routledge Companion on World Literature with Stephen Helgeson. He is, as he mentioned, teaching at Aarhus. He's been at the forefront of developments in post-humanism, digital humanities, and other related fields. And he's a phenomenal interlocutor for all of you in Denmark and Europe writ large. So with that, what we'll do is I'll pass it over to Christian to guide us. And please excuse Christian, because you're going to hear some munching as we all continue to nib on lunch here. You should get some for yourself as well.
So, yeah, did you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. So I'm gonna start. Yeah, wait a minute. Yep. Okay. Okay, I'm very happy to be here with you today and to share this time with David Stentiford, whom I have not had the pleasure of meeting personally yet. I would also like to thank Hector, Jimena, Azucena, Joao, and Romina for the opportunity to be part of Materia today. I would have loved to be present in the room, but with classes, it was impossible to me to make the trip. First of all, I owe you an explanation for the title of my presentation, Literature Facing Gaia, and for the disturbing photo that appears in the flyer for the promotion of the event, which I suggested to Azucena. Both things, the title and the photo, although apparently unconnected, are linked and create meaning together. I propose to give you a biographic account of these two things as a critical point of entry into the subject, to let ideas, questions, and doubts flow and collide like excited electrons. I discovered Michael Ackerman's photo when I stumbled across his book, End Time City, a book of photographs published by Robert Delpire in 1999 and republished and augmented by Atelier EXB in 2018 in French. I was not familiar with Ackerman's work, and his radical and unique aesthetic immediately caught my attention. I was struck by the materiality and grain of the images, the extreme lights, the trembling presence of being, animal, human, ghost, oscillating between life and death, dream and reality. By the disturbing strangeness with which they look at us and question us, like like the monkey walking along an electric cable hanging in the void, reminding us of the unstable equilibrium that defines us, or the grainy image in which our eyes confuse the human fragile silhouettes in a drifting boat and the flight of seagulls, or the compassionate embrace of another monkey that reminds us of where we come from, or rather, what we have been endlessly running away from, our animality. After my doctorate, and in the midst of a bit of a crisis with respect to research, reviewing my practices, my methodology, my conceptual framework for reading and studying literature, I began to take an interest in environmental humanities and eco-criticism. This turn was motivated in part by the interest I had in anthropologists like Philippe Descola and at seeing Arturo Escobar, Viveiro de Castro, Tim Ingold, and Alfred Gell, and was accompanied by my discovery of the pioneering work of Gisela Jefes in the field of Latin American eco-criticism, and the books of Ursula Hayes and Ada Smilbegovic, Imagine Extension and Poetics of Liveness, respectively. My readings on French constructivists emulating Whitehead, like Etienne Soguiot, Isabelle Stengers, and Bruno Latour, and of a certain current of contemporary philosophy that integrated other living beings into the corpus of their concerns, broadening the horizon of the cognizable, or more importantly, of the sensible, but also essential. My turn as a researcher, in short, followed in the wake of the ontological turn that was taking place in human sciences, with anthropologists in the forefront, and also responded to the collective experience of living something new. Our time is defined by the critical revision of the anthropocentric paradigm that relies on the binary opposition between nature and culture, and human and non-human. As Isabelle Stenger points out in A Catastrophic Times, Resisting the Coming Barbarism, we are collectively experiencing the intrusion of Gaia in our lives. Not the Gaia of mythology, not an abstract entity, sometimes maternal, sometimes cruel to her children, but Gaia as a living organism with her own regime of activity. The fact that the event of the intrusion of Gaia is unilateral, that it does not ask anything of us, does not mean that we do not have to or cannot react. Gaia comes to name that is what is already happening. In that sense, it translates a pragmatic operation. As Stenger writes, to name is not to say what is true, but to confer on what is named the power to make us feel, and this in the mode that the name calls for. Thus, the response to create is not a response to Gaia, but a response as much to what provoked her intrusion as to its consequences. It is important for me to make something clear. What I am interested in retaining from Gaia is the concept and the diagnosis it puts for, the critical dimension that it opens, in the sense of Greek word crisis, which contains the idea of opportunity for change, the chance to conceive of a new ways of imagining, thinking, feeling, and acting. In no case does Gaia represent for me a cold panic or paralysis before the inevitable, nor does it represent a melancholic attitude before the imminence of the end, like that of Justine in Lars von Trier's film Melancholia. It is not a matter of withdrawing into an imaginary hat, holding hands and waiting stoically for the collision, nor of preparing as some survivalists do for the final war, that of the human against the human without humanity, a war between ex-human, like the one waged by the protagonist of the Road, the novel by Cormac McCarthy. Although thinking about the end, or what comes after the end, is becoming a very interesting exercise in philosophical speculation nowadays. On that, I might refer you to the work of Bentham Meillassoux in France, Ray Brassier, or Thomas Monichen, among others. Neither the world with us, as Melancholia proposes, nor us without the world, as the road proposes our solution. Rather, my emphasis is on us with the world, our fragile dependence of the world, or rather on the critical zone that we share with other living beings. Returning to my biobiographic account, I can pick out some clear ideas. The examination of my own condition of knowledge production, the researcher crisis, led me to question my methods and practices. The reading of certain authors or the frequentation of other disciplines open up a new fields of possibles, potentialities, a more plural epistemological horizon. And all of this reverted recursively on my own discipline. Had literary studies, with the exception of eco-criticism, abandoned the Western epistemic rationale of modernization and the blind race toward progress? Had it questioned it? In short, what was the collective reaction of all authors, critics, and publishers to the intrusion of Gaia into our lives and to the paradigm shift forced upon us by the Anthropocene? I would like to open a parenthesis here before addressing this question. If I had proposed the biobiographic narrative as a form of presentation, it is partly because I found it interesting to contrast the very different way in which France and the United States think about literature, both in terms of creation, criticism, and the market. For those who are not familiar with this French case, the French Academy remains rigorously structuralist and formal. Literary studies preserve an autonomous disciplinary space with its own rules and codes for the analysis of text. There is a way of reading text that is learned from early on in the school and that has at its corollary exercise the famous dissertation, an exercise that the students have to manage to perfection in order to pass competitive exams and progress in their careers. This generates molds and practices of reflection limited by the very form of the exercise, and in turn explain why cultural studies have had so little success in French universities, although this is changing, thankfully. The disciplinary crossover is seen more as a threat than an enrichment, which provoke movements of withdrawal and protection. The fact that certain heterodox and unclassifiable French thinkers in France, Latour and Derrida, to cite but two examples, have fared better within American academia than in France is not surprising. End of parenthesis. Now it is time to turn to the question, or rather to the answer. First of all, I propose to provide a general brief overview of the situation in which literary studies find itself. First, a statement. The model of language that we have inherited from the Greek tradition is a model based on the binary logic of design, as evidenced by the success of computer language in our days, the binary code that has adapted so well to our way of thinking. Literature, as we know it today, is epistemologically and ontologically anchored upon this model of technical rationality. The linguistic sign, formed by the signifier and the signified, is accompanied by the whole series of equivalent oppositions. Form and content, oral writing, popular cult, poetry, prose, author, reader, avant-garde, classical, theory, practice. It is through this discontinuous pair that the modern edifice of literature has been built, let's say since German Romanticism. All the categories we deal with come in one way or another, and depending on where we place the pole of interest from this play of opposition, are do the blueprints of the discipline: rhetoric, stylistics, poetics, genetic criticism. All this is reinforced by two axes, both horizontal and vertical, and progressive temporality, a movement forward, in which literary movements, trends, aesthetics, or generation succeed one another in a race without a finish line, where the avant-garde is the hair on the loose that everyone catches and then lets go at some point in their lives. The arrival of internet and the digital world provoked an earthquake in literary studies. As three of the pillars on which the idea of literature has been based for the last 3 centuries. On which the idea of literature has been based for the last 3 centuries have been threatened. The author, the idea of originality, and the book as the primary support for writing. The apocalyptic discourses so present in our society with the arrival of the new millennium have also reached literary studies. I could cite 20 publications in French in recent years announcing the end, the death, and the adieu of literature. The old dispute between the ancients and the moderns has given way to a whole range of sensibilities and ideological positions. The anachronistic gesture contrasting with the presentism of the market. I hope to be read in 1640, writes Pascal Quignal in the first volume of his Petit Traité. Certain writers, like Quignal, no longer write for the future, for posterity, as was common currency, but write for the past, for anteriority. Their future is, in this sense, as in Koselleck's book, a future past. On the other hand, the discourse of productivity, the colonization of time, of our minds and our attention, have also reached the literary field, pampered by the logic of capitalist profitability that reigns in society. Writers also have to account for their operation and are forced to publish with a certain regularity, if not to be present in the import sphere, in a sort of exercise of self-promotion of their books. Creativity is guided by the imperative of the market, which paradoxically contradicts the supposed crisis dominating the field. In France, for example, in 2021, according to the National Book Center, the book market grew by 18%. However, the number of readers is progressively decreasing, 9% less in 21 compared to 2020. If I am attempting to provide this panoramic vision of the tension that crosses the field and the discipline, it is to be able to confront with greater lucidity the question outlined above. As we have seen, and by way of synthesis, ontologically, the system of compression that sustains the edifice of literature continues to respond to a binary logic, that of Western technical reason, and let us not forget that of the language of capitalism, the language of computer and information. This condenses it to a series of automatic response, action, reaction, that make it impossible and maniacal as it functions with watertight compartments and partial responses. The example that best illustrates this paralysis is the theory-practice dilemma that the language of capitalism has also been able to exploit. Literature is always the strongest that never knows how to take action. And this is so partly because both the body and emotions, potential subjectivity, have been denied by the supposed objective scientificity of the method, by rhetoric, by stylistic, by the cold poetics of the structuralist. Wanting to preserve its autonomy, it has become shaped in the fabric it has woven for itself. The problem is that both the intrusion of Gaia and Anthropocene make necessary for us to do something else, and with urgency, if we don't want to go down in history as immobilists or collaborators of the old climate regime. Likewise, eco-criticism must, on the basis of its achievements, reformulate its praxeology. In my opinion, it is not only a matter of identifying environmental tropes, as Gisela Heffen brilliantly does when she goes through the rhetoric of waste. Nor is it is a question of establishing a corpus of work committed to the cause, or of reading the work from outside, adopting a distant, conscious and critical position. In fact, there is an excess of criticism. The challenge for eco-criticism is to intervene poetically in the environment, to react and to act to Gaia's intrusion, to describe less and to take more action. This, of course, implies, as Dante Liano points out, a paradigm shift in both creation and criticism. It implies opening the literary act to other epistemologies, to other practices, to other ways of doing and conceiving poiesis, not so much linked to verbal or literary production, but Aristotle wanted to the direct and concrete transformation of the physical world. Confronting Gaia's intrusion cannot be limited to an environmental problem, as if the hole in the ocean layer, the acidification of the oceans, the disappearance of species or climate change were isolated and unconnected factors. Confronting the intrusion of Gaia means identifying as a stranger rights the causes and consequences of the problem, challenging the economic model that has brought us this far, modifying habit and habitat, the oikos of ecology, through a new logos, a new non-extractive and non-predatory logic, as well as a new language with a greater capacity to name the complexity and nuance to the interdependent relationship between the living beings and that populate the planet. Well, I don't know if I have time, but I would like to show you just some concrete examples of different ways of dealing with Gaia. In this case, as Frank Lebovici writes, it is a question of writing operation that writing operation that do not say their name, or in other words, of poetic apparatuses or devices, dispositif, as Christoph Hanna calls them, that call into crisis the idea we have for literature. Moreover, in this case, there is a triple questioning surrounding authorship, the form of interaction with the works, and surrounding the medium that supports them. Christian Bock's The Xenotext, Box 1, is a collection of linked poems on the theme of extinction, immortality, and poetry. And it is the product of a desire to write poetry that will last as long as life on Earth. In short, Bock's The Xenotext experiments involve the insertion of a poem called Orpheus into the DNA of living bacteria in hope that this organism will, in response, create another poem called Eurydice, in the form of the protein expressed on the basis of the inserted DNA sequence. The host organism responds to the sequence grafted into its genome by expressing this gene into the form of a benign protein that is itself a new text. In other words, the microorganism that Bock has implanted become the co-author of a new poem. Right there. Christian Bock writes, wrote, yesterday I received confirmation from the laboratory at the University of Calgary that my poetic cipher in XP13 has in fact caused E. coli to fluoresce. I can read read in our test runs, meaning that when implanted in the genome of this bacterium, my poem, which begins and a style of life is prim, does in fact cause the bacterium to write. In response, its own poem, which begins, the fairy is rosy and of glow. I have finally demonstrated the viability of the gene, which has taken me about a year to design. And he continued, I believe that such a poem stored inside the genome of a bacterium might conceivably outlast terrestrial civilization itself, persisting like a secret message in a bottle flung at random into a giant ocean. At the same time, he observes, I hope that my poem might urge readers to reconsider the aesthetic potential of science, causing them to recognize that buried within the building blocks of life, there really does exist an innate beauty, if not a hidden poetry, a literal message that we might read, if only we then to look for it. In other words, bacteria becomes an archive of a certain idea of poetry, a poem that is actually alive, a poem that is likely endure longer than any reader or any concept of poetry. As pointed out by Darren Weisler, Bock's Xenotext experiment is a boundary object par excellence, in the sense that Susan Lake Starr and James Grismer define boundary objects as those objects that inhabit several intersecting social worlds and satisfy the informational requirements of each of them. It is a project designed to assess the aesthetic potential of genetics in contemporary culture. It takes its name from the Greek prefix "xenos" or the foreign, which usually designates a difference between species. We can situate Bock's experiment within the constraint-based practices of pataphysics, Oulipo, or conceptual poetry. Although his wager is, if possible, much riskier, and he intends to generate a three-dimensional molecule, so the permutation of linguistic codes. Theory and practice, substance and form, concept and affection become one and the same in Bock's exercise. In conclusion, what I'm interested in highlighting with this example of living poetry facing Gaia is not the content of the project in itself, but rather the shift in perspective that simultaneously forces a reconsideration of what we mean when we talk about biology, media art, poetry, communication studies, and culture itself. As Darren Weisler points out again, thinking about cells, molecules, proteins, and genes as surface for reading and writing is, in other words, as media, has all kinds of interesting implications, including the ongoing need to rethink what it means to be an author. Indeed, the experiment involves a variety of collaborators involving different institutions and sources of funding. It questions what it means to be a poet and what it means to write a poem. In short, it forces us to reconsider our own roles as readers. It forces the author to think about his or her role in the process of creation, and it places literature and criticism in front of the deformed mirror of their own past, forcing them to revisit their heuristic and their own ontology. Thank you very much, and sorry for going over time.
Thank you, Christian. We're going to set up the room for David's slides. It's a good time for a second round, the lunch round.
How was the sound?
Is there
That
a
was perfect.
Cool.
We're just trying to see how we can manage to switch to, to David's computer.
Hang on. I think it's good. Let me just drag it over to the. Maybe not yet. No.
But that was actually a really good experience.
I guess you can tired.
I was actually tired. I was glad it was to take a 30-minute nap before we went for dinner.
Yeah.
Very well. Are you coming tomorrow?
Okay. Stop mirroring.
Well, I guess he's
Another alternative would be to
Yeah.
share it with.
Next week. Alone on campus.
Maybe another way to do it is just to send your PowerPoint to Azucena or Joao, and we show it on the screen, right? Easier.
Oh, to the stream call.
Okay.
So that's the, also because for recording, you need to be.
Okay, so just a little.
You have the
Okay,
link.
let's the images aren't essential, so I'll just kind of skip it.
Sure, because otherwise we can, if you join the Zoom call, I think you can, I can otherwise,
Okay,
resend you the.
okay, so can you send me the link to the Zoom
Yes.
call? Okay.
Okay. Get it?
Not yet. I think those are all.
I'm hoping they will stick to 20.
I'll just go for it. Or I can.
I sent it to the Stentiford.
Okay, let's just, I'll maybe just scrap it. It's just a few novel covers really. Okay, so a big thank you to Hector, Jimena, Sophia, Joao, and Azucena for having me here, and for all of you for making space for me. This is I want to sort of follow Christian's prompt to think about this maybe intersection of bacteria and poetry. The chapter I'm going to share with you today, a chunk from today, is from my dissertation, A Bluer Planet, Seaweed, Mariculture, and the Domestication of the Oceans, 1940 to 2000. The first part of the chapter starts with a theoretical knot, which I won't cover, but I'll just mention briefly. So it deals with the concept of socio-technical imaginaries from the field of STS. Jasanoff and Kim want to refocus on issues of power in our accounts. They say actor network theory does not account for uneven power relations in networks. And so they say that the imaginary is one way to do this. And the claim they make, which is I think maybe the problem for this group, is that they say the imaginary is a domain exclusive to the human. And And this is where they draw a bright line between their position and sort of the extension of agency to matter itself beyond human artifacts. And so in this section that I'm skipping, I try to sort of think through, I think this actually reinscribes problems with power in sort of, it shuts down maybe a decolonial STS in a way. But I'll save that and I'll just take you to ocean farms, because I know that's what you're really interested in. Okay, so a few claims to start. In what follows, I wish to advance a few, I'm just going to time myself here, so I know where I'm at. In what follows, I wish to advance a few related claims. First, that ecological technologies dreamed of in the second half of the 20th century stabilized, that is, and this is socio-technical imaginaries language, stabilized, that is, formed constituencies and became embedded in institutions through processes of naturalization. This is what I'm adding, this naturalization. Ecotechnics requires naturalization. What role could technological ideals play within a social movement, often positioned critically against large socio-technical systems like nuclear power generation or extractive industries like whaling and fossil fuel exploration? Here are some of my claims about how socio-technical imaginaries did this work. So first, I argue that eco-technological systems, and I'm going to be talking about aquaculture and ocean farms, needed to be naturalized in their form and function. The application of systems concepts made their forms legible as ecological analogs. Similarly, their functions were often aimed at enhancing natural systems. Second, I show how frontier tropes and narratives of social evolution were relied upon to justify the scale of these agricultural systems and their implementation, often in the global commons of the ocean. If you read anything about the oceans in the 1950s, in English, it's about the ocean as a frontier. This trope runs everywhere through the discourse. Okay, this is a familiar story about rights, progress, and improvement of the land to enable dispossession, and in this case, a claim of rights to enhance the sea. In short, the story goes like this. Humans have existed as hunters and gatherers at sea. Fishing is a type of hunting and gathering, and the time has come to evolve to be cultivators of these waters. This sentiment runs from the 40s to today. It's echoed through the archives for me. So I'm going to sort of skip ahead a little bit. Okay, ocean farm imaginaries. So gaining mainstream attention in the 1940s, environmental thinkers in the US and elsewhere raised concerns about the ecological limits of modern agricultural systems. Soil erosion, phosphorus and nitrogen bottlenecks, the availability of arable and freshwater, these were all cited as formidable limits constraining agriculture's potential to meet the food needs of a rapidly growing population. Malthusian thought. Garrett Hardin and Paul Ehrlich of Stanford, associated with the tragedy of the commons and the population bomb, respectively, were two of the most prominent Malthusian voices in this vein. Their predictions of overshoot, as we know, did not come to pass. The Green Revolution increased the availability and use of synthetic fertilizers and so on, resistant crops. And these gains in food production, as we know, came at costs of environmental degradation and vertical integration of agricultural economies. Before Hardin and Ehrlich issued their warnings, both in 1968, however, an alternative vision of agriculture's future circulated, that is, cultivating the seas. So the Blue Revolution was a sort of counter discourse or a counter imaginary to the Green Revolution. The answer to the limits to growth for some thinkers was a turn to the ocean. And so for Hardin and to a greater extent Ehrlich, ocean farms were targets of their critique. This, and I simply mean to say that here, that the limits of growth debate, looking at that, we can understand questions of ocean productivity and cultivation were central to the schemes for the implementation. Anyways, I'm trying to recenter this question of ocean productivity in environmental imaginaries in the 20th century. Okay, so this you can sort of this is the first sort of exhibit I have for you today. This is Arthur C. Clarke's The Deep Range. You can see this is an outline of a whale and a human, and inside the silhouette is a microscopic view of plankton. And there's this kind of idea of a moral connection between the smallest organisms on Earth and the largest organisms of Earth being interdependent. Okay, this is a zany novel. Arthur C. Clarke's speculative novel, The Deep Range from 1957, tells the homecoming story of Walter Franklin, a space cowboy returned to Earth after developing astrophobia, a fear of deep space. Franklin overcomes his traumatic past by working as an ocean warden, tending to migratory whales, herded on the oceanic frontier and the planktonic pastures. This is a Western narrative, set at sea. Rising up in the Marine Division as a promising young bureaucrat, Franklin, at the end of the novel, is persuaded by the head of the global Buddhist monastic order, who is a white man, to stop killing whales for meat and oil and to start raising them for milk instead. This is Clarke writing in Ceylon right after independence, and he imagines the head of this philosophical religion as a white guy. Clarke's two frontiers of ocean and space exploration are thus domesticated through Franklin's personal repair and enlightenment journey. Notably, plankton and planet, Clarke would later note, both come from the ancient Greek word for drifter or wanderer. Dreams of life off planet and life below the sea were deeply entangled for Clarke and for this wider imaginary that I'm identifying. Okay, so I'll show you another text you might be familiar with, Make Room by Harry Harrison, and the film dramatization of it, Soylent Green. Soylent Green is people, right? Okay, so more familiar perhaps is a British author, Harry Harrison's 1966 dystopian population thriller, Make Room, that imagined a near future world in which all but 3 whales had gone extinct. And the government had repurposed nuclear submarines in this world to fill the niche of these whales. And so these nuclear submarines would harvest plankton by screening water. And on the nuclear submarine, they would use nuclear power to dry the plankton, and they would create this food which was marketed as energy, ENER-G, which the characters would add to their oatmeal. When the novel was dramatized in the 1973 film Soylent Green, these plankton meals took on a darker meaning. It's through the discovery of an oceanographic report produced by the Soylent Corporation that the detective Robert Thorne learns that the oceans are dead. He then pieces together the dramatic reveal at the end of the film. The mass-produced Soylent Green wafers are not composed of ocean-harvested algae, but instead they are the ground-up remains of humans harvested from the surplus population. In this way, the film redoubles the domestication story. The human is shifted from the subject of domestication to its object. In popular nonfiction, the imaginary of a domesticated ocean projected the idea of enhancement and plankton enhancement and harvesting to that of full-fledged cultivation, ocean farms. And so here we are in the world of nonfiction. In 1949, leftist commentator James Rorty, you might know the name, father of philosopher Richard Rorty, imagined ocean farming as a way to close mineral cycles, master photosynthesis, and overcome famine. In 1968, Stuart Brand in the Whole Earth catalog says, "We are as gods, we might as well get good at it." 1949, here's James Rorty. Quote, "By constructing a single global ecology at the highest technological level, we can banish hunger from history. Mankind can be as gods." Staying with nonfiction. Here's Clarke's 1960 work, The Challenge of the Sea, which is a sort of nonfiction text, where he further explored ways to use underwater nuclear power stations to upwell deep, nutrient-rich water to make these ocean deserts bloom. Most of the ocean's upper waters, Clarke noted for his readers, are limited by nitrogen, iron, and other elements, and which prevents plankton growth. Boosting the base of the trophic pyramid, that is cultivating the floating prairies, would mean an ocean with more fish and a recalibration of planetary limits. Okay, so that's the point there, is that the ocean is not functioning at its full potential, according to Clarke, right? That there's an intervention to be made in these planetary systems. Moreover, coral atolls could be used to make aquaculture enclosures. Atolls are these coral reefs with a big bay in the middle. These could be used to enclose fish populations. This is a big problem for ocean farmers. What is enclosure? Further, sea dams could be used to control nutrient flows and to affect Earth's temperature. So here is Clarke in 1960 saying that we can manipulate the temperature of Earth with these ocean systems. And so as an aside, let's check how I'm doing on time. As an aside, one of the sort of themes that runs through my research is the ways in which the ocean and ocean imaginaries made planetary interventions thinkable before the atmosphere was sort of centered as an object of concern later on in the 70s and 80s. To put it in another way, before geoengineering and terraforming, we have ocean engineering or aquaforming or these ocean farms. This is sort of where the world and the planet collide, in a sense. This is where the planet becomes thinkable as an instrument. Okay, so while this cultural imaginary is largely forgotten today and overlooked by environmental historians, it did stabilize in discourse and later in other cultural domains of theme parks. The imaginary also stabilized institutionally. The US Congress established the National Sea Grant College Program in 1966, modeled after the land grant system. Geographers have emphasized the role that the land grant universities played in supporting plantation production in the United States from 1860s forward, right about in the middle of the Civil War. Sea Grant, in a similar way, seeks to extend terrestrial agriculture to America's claims in the oceans. Okay, so this is kind of broad overview. And now I'm going to talk to you about this trope of the frontier and the plantation. The gist here is that historians have done a lot of work to talk about the role of the frontier trope in ocean thinking in the 20th century, but they haven't critiqued the implications of it, which is settlement, colonization, agriculture, and so forth. That's a major disconnect in the history, which I'm trying to intervene in. I'll just sort of skip ahead. So I'm going to give you two examples, the most kind of striking examples from the archives of thinking about these ocean farms as plantations. I'll give you two of these, one from a free market economist and another from a sort of an ocean booster, mariculture booster and sort of prominent public figure. Okay, so preeminent free market economist Gordon Tullock, known for his work on public choice theory and rent seeking, in 1966, about the same time, wrote an essay titled "The Fisheries: Some Radical Proposals." Tullock was very explicit to say by radical, he meant something different than the connotations of Trotskyist ideals. He wanted to appropriate this idea of the radical for his project. Tullock used the figure of the ocean farm to highlight problems with the commons, as he and his colleagues saw them. For Tullock, improvement and ownership were necessarily linked, right? If you wanted to get to these schemes of enhancing fisheries, you needed some form of property, some form of ownership. And the opposite is true. If you have ownership, then you can start to think. Okay, so that is in the ocean commons, where exclusion cannot be established through property rights. Only a fool, in his words, would be inclined to improve a fishery. And on his logic, for instance, no individual fisherman would have incentive to fertilize the oceans to increase fish stocks because other boats could simply capture the marginal gains that his or her capital produced. You need a way to exclude people. Through the extensive application of property rights, Tulloch reasoned greater and even sustainable exploitation of ocean fisheries could be managed. In his imagined future, operators would begin with naturally semi-enclosed formations like bays, lagoons, coral reefs, and atolls like Clark to establish claims that could be easily defined as exclusive. Then slowly the industry, he thought, could move offshore. It could scale with use of pens and fences. For Tulloch, Clark, and others, the 440 atolls of the world were somehow waiting to be improved, left for the taking, as Bikini Atoll was for nuclear testing just years earlier. In the case of Polynesia, Tulloch wrote, the wide diversity of reef fishes on the coral prevented the local fishers, he used primitivist tropes to represent them here, from creating regular markets that would allow them to exploit the fisheries more effectively. Coral reefs are full of diversity, therefore you can't create an easy fish market because you'd be bringing different species to the market every day. In this way, Tulloch relies on Lockean ideals of improvement, if not to explicitly justify dispossession, he doesn't go there, but to indeed project an outside agricultural model on the, quote, inefficient local economy. Writing from the University of South Carolina in the 60s, Tulloch also proposed a tidal mode of aquaculture. These large tidal rice plantations built by unfree labor from West Africa, he thought, could be repurposed as large-scale tidal fish farms. The future of aquaculture, in his view, would literally inundate the landscape shaped by slave labor and agricultural ingenuity. Okay, so this is there's a very literal way that the plantation is working there, and I'm still trying to think through that. And so I'll give you my final example, and then wrap things up. I see I've just got a few minutes, so I'll move quickly. So Tapp Pryor is an aquaculture advocate and practitioner in his 90s, still working to disrupt the oyster farming industry in Maine. In 1962, Pryor leased an old military airstrip in Waimanalo, Hawaii, near Honolulu. There he established something called the Oceanic Foundation, which he believed would lead the U.S. into the sea, and as the next frontier. And Pryor's an interesting guy. At the Oceanic Institute was the anthropologist and cybernetician Gregory Bateson, who was finishing up Steps to an Ecology of Mind, to give you a sense of this sort of future-oriented multidisciplinary space. So for a special issue of on mariculture running in the Oceans magazine in 1979, Pryor wrote a short story titled Hawaii Seafood Plantation 1981, Commercial Aquaculture Automated. The story is told through the point of view of a young woman who manages the oyster farm from a central command and control location. This is, you can sort of see this. Through a series of computer queries, she begins her day by checking the critical indicators for the health of the system. A series of interconnected tanks link microalgae, plankton, to oyster, to macroalgae, and she walks us through this. That is, sunlight and fertilizer are used on the farm to culture phytoplankton, which is then pumped into acres of tanks filled with hungry oysters. The tanks are aligned in a series and in parallel with the slope of the aircraft runway. In this way, seawater could be pumped to the top of the system and it would flow downhill. The manager in the story is particularly chuffed by the thought of oyster effluent, which we learn is used at the plantation to fertilize eucuma, an easily cultured species of red algae for food and carrageenan. So not a closed system per se, but a bioregenerative system that appears to recycle its own waste products into marketable commodities. I know I've just got a few seconds left, so I'm gonna sort of cut it here. You know, the final thought of this story is, you know, we hear the internal thoughts of this manager, and here's a quote: "She was one of the few who seriously believed that aquaculture could easily solve the world food shortages. Sometimes she joked that what this country needed is a good 5-cent oyster, but she meant it." And the vision she's imagining here is a network of plantations, all connected through satellite, which would be controlled from downtown Honolulu. And she sort of imagines this vision spreading across all of the old abandoned runways, these remnants of World War II and occupation of the US occupation of the Pacific. Okay, so I'm out of time, but the next move I talk about is scale, harnessing, and the sort of portability of this all. And the way that this imaginary sort of trucks in scalability. But I'll leave things there, and I look forward to discussion with everyone.
Great. Christian, can you see me and hear me? Super. Great. So thank you both for excellent presentations. With so much to absorb. I really feel I learned a lot about the book market, sort of the fringe of your subject. Fantasies of drawings I made in the late 70s in school about underwater fish farming came to mind. So, love that. So I think I should just respond, and then you can pick and choose from what I say. So to Christian, I have 4 or 5 comments to your excellent presentation. First of all, I mean, I'm curious about Gaia as a symbol or as a figure. It seems to sort of, in literature, we often have a tendency to meet heroes. In every narrative, there has to be a hero of sorts. And Gaia seems to be sort of a very flexible hero because it encompasses everything. But the question is, of course, if everything is the hero or the kind of systems, and you still have this, I think, nice formulation of insisting that we should live in the world. That it's not about a apocalyptic or being outside of the world, but you actually take a stance where you should find a way to inscribe humans in the world. Then I think the question of, I mean, how does Gaia and the human, how do they relate to each other? So that was my first point. My second would be that you sort of have a call for action also, that there's a need for literature that sort of can be described as impotent, that has not been able to act in the world. And you could say that there's sort of a conflicting aspect of the way that on the one hand, the literature could be a call for action. On the other hand, you also often see literature's purpose is to make things more complex. That there's a search, and in particular of some of the writers that you have engaged with, there's certainly a lot of sort of an ambition to say things are not as simple as they look. There are many storylines, interests, and so on interwoven with each other. So the second point is sort of how do we mitigate that or get the best of both worlds in terms of understanding both complexity, but without losing literature's engagement with some kind of call for action. And it's something I've been very taken with in the past few years. I'll just briefly mention that I have a former PhD student, Kenneth Toa Nzar, who originates from Cameroon, just received a large prize for his PhD in the Francophone world. He was in Cairo 2 weeks ago to receive that, and wrote a thesis called "Can Literature Save the Congo Basin?" And what he did was, on the one hand, also to investigate the kind of literature that engages with deforestation in Congo, while at the same time also following the trace of how literature is actually being used. What are the ways that people who works in NGOs but also engages with literature, who tries to find a platform for literature, but also to both work on the political level and also on the, you could say, societal level of creating engagement. So complexity versus action. Then a third point I was thinking, which is perhaps more theoretical, but I really liked the way that you sort of put up all these binaries that we are so accustomed to think with. I mean, you can skip it if it doesn't resonate, but I've been very much taken recently with Italo Calvino's work and the way he thinks in paradoxes, to try to put up conflicting values, but insisting that we should be able to navigate conflicting values, and thereby also sort of without losing the sense of dichotomies, but also sort of circumvent that we have to choose one or the other. So I think that kind of thinking, which also has precursors in, for example, the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann and his call for thinking about oscillating between different poles, is a mode of thinking that again caters to the complexity, but also does it within a framework where we can actually explain what kind of operation and values that is that we're trying to build. My fourth point would then be, if you could comment a little bit about, I mean, trying to push back a little bit against what Christian Böck is doing. Because on the one hand, it's obviously that you could call it some kind of writing, but what is the status of that kind of writing? Is that sort of, it could come off as a gimmick, and of course something that really sort of makes an impression, but in the sense that you call it writing, what is the status of that kind of writing again? Then my final point is, and hopefully it could be a segue also to David's work, would begin to sort of go back to the Gaia and think of, do we have sort of all-encompassing systems? I mean, that's sort of the idea of the whole, but don't we need sort of a subdivision of that, of something that recognizes habitats, systems that are not compatible, they cannot be merged into one big unit, but there has to be sort of an idea of different kind of borders, and something that you could say that many societies are building at the moment. I think Ursula Heisen mentions also the Anthropocene optimism of rewilding, that this is actually something that you could do, and in this world where humans has so much capacity for shaping, then actually giving back is one of the strategies of figuring out how can we have not just a Gaia, but also a Gaia with different habitats, because there are things that are not commensurable to put together, but still needs to sort of live side by side rather, and that's perhaps the most viable strategy. So those were 5 points, and shouldn't I just continue with David and then
Yes.
have a more dynamic discussion afterwards? So also very short anecdotally, my father used to tell me that in Jutland, where I originate from in Denmark, back in around 1900, laborers usually had in the contract that they were not to be served salmon more than 6 times per week, because that kind of food was just abundant. So like things that are changing. I think it's I mean, the whole idea of frontier and of course the realities of the underworld, plantation and so on is really fascinating. One question is, of course, I mean, what the role of technology means here. I mean, it seems like that you're to some degree not a techno against technology, but that there actually are problems that that can be or should be fixed, and so many other things. I think that's a big discussion. What is the role of technology in order to avoid the consequences of human actions? So that's of course a big discussion of what to do with that. I think you talk about power. I think politics. I would like to hear. I mean, also, I mean, what you think of that, because those two things are a little bit different. And in this whole field, also when it comes to Christian, you say that this is the problem that of course politics is a useful and necessary instrument of guiding collective action, but it's also flawed in the sense that if we want it to be more inclusive, we really don't have great models of figuring out how to include the non-human in politics. Not that it is impossible, because you would say not all humans are included in politics. Also, humans who are not cognitive capable of being in politics do have a voice and are represented in other ways. But when it comes to animal life, we really have a deficit of figuring out a model of doing that. Then I would be curious also to think about, I mean, if you're tracing sort of when does capitalism enter all of this? Because on the one hand, you sort of start with a discourse of this 1940s that you actually have sort of a genuine concern for how do we produce enough protein and carbohydrates to keep people alive, and which you could say, fortunately, for other reasons, and also with some problems surrounding that, it's not the biggest problem. So the biggest problem is how to actually distribute the food that we're producing. But when does the capitalist narrative enter into that story? Is it there from the beginning, or does it become more and more visible as a motif and the desire behind making the ocean a new kind of plantation? And just out of curiosity, if there are any precursors you go into, I would say that someone like Galdón would be an obvious front runner for someone who thought about could we have an underworld where we would harvest, and also with a lot of angry messages to what human does to each other and to wildlife as such. So already around 1870, you have actually a fully fledged vision of what underground harvesting of natural resources could look like, and into a very detailed ethical framework of how that could be seen. And a final, just because I think it's an important contemporary writer who's one of the best in navigating the whole scene between the post-human and the Anthropocene, Margaret Atwood, has a very spirited article in a response to the Stanford professor Ian Morris in the book called Foragers, Farmers, and Fossil Fuels, where she explicitly say, well, we shouldn't forget about the oceans, how important it is, and how we overlook that as sort of the fifth horseman of the apocalypse. This is where we really could end up going very wrong. So I think that as a context would be something that you may or may not be able to use. So again, thank you so much for your presentation.
Right, dear speakers, short responses, please. We're technically here until 1:30. Technically, we can stay a little longer, but I know some folks will have classes and might have to dash out. So quick responses, please, to open it up for questions. Christian.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, please. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, as I say in the Kafka quote at the beginning, with which, yeah, I opened my presentation, we also have weapons. I mean, and we have to use them. We have to use this weapon. A friend of mine who works at Google was telling me that the company had hired someone from outside the company to give employees just a talk on Marx and Marxism. And this episode, for me, reflects well the place that is reserved to for the humanities in a contemporary society. I mean, The enemy invites us to its house for dinner. It is no longer afraid of us. I mean, it's scary. It has completely deactivated us. In that sense, I feel close to the position of the accelerationist. Neither literature nor criticism can always be in a position of the defense, in its position of observation of society, nor multiplying value judgments. And yeah, we have to move to the action. It's my point with politics, and I know that complexity is the big word in our times. We are all the time dealing with complexity, not only in literature, in other human science, and I think that is the big challenge. But yeah, I think that yeah, we have to occupy the ground, to gain space, to learn from other ontological models what literature is from. I mean, from community of indigenous people, where there is no split between theory and practice, and where in the case of Christian Bock, to poetics of the living and interspecies language can be generated. So it's all of, I can say.
Great, Nets, thanks for your incredibly insightful comments here. Maybe I'll just touch on one very briefly, but I'm thinking about all of them. Where does capitalism enter into this? And in the, like with socio-technical imaginaries, there's this idea that it's a sort of common sense that is something different from ideology. And one thing I hope to do with this chapter is suggest that the global commons is a sort of an open problem, that and certainly some of these ocean farms are like the Tulloch guy, very compatible with a very traditional model of capitalism. Another thinker I didn't mention is someone named Elizabeth Mann Borghese, daughter of Tomas Mann, and the mother of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is the sort of most complex sort of legal. Anyways, she thought that cultivation of the oceans could lead to global governance. Yeah. And would that be a sort of socialist future or a capitalist future? It's sort of open. So I've been trying to array these different ideological strands within a larger socio-technical imaginary. Maybe I can make that more explicit. More to say about the role of the oceans in making capitalism global. I think there's a lot to say there, but I'll confine my comments. Thank you.
Let the floor is open, everyone.
Anyone that wants to jump in?
No one has.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for this very. I think I'm gonna put the camera for Christian because I'm here. Thank you for these very wonderful presentations. And I hope to formulate them as quick questions. I have a question for Christian. You talked about the urgency to act and related literature to action, but I think that action has two kind of complexities. Is the need to act fast, but then to include as many voices as possible, plurality of voices. So to what point do you think the literature you work with or the material you've been working with encompasses that plurality of voices? And the other question related to that too is you work with this material that is concerned with science. I mean, the natural sciences, biology, and you relate that, I think, to the necessity to work with concrete transformations of the physical world, and that leads a criticism to engage with the sciences, right? But I'm wondering, up to what point do you think the sciences are including us, the humanities? Because when you take, for example, the IPCC report or the UN climate reports, where are the humanities subjects included in those reports, which are very important and connected to action? Well, that's a question for you. And then I have another question for David. I wonder up to what point, or if it's something that you engage in your research, is this managing of the oceans related to energy questions. When I read the story, which is very engaging, there seems to be a relation with this valorization of food industry there, that it comes in connection. And I'm working also with energy questions. I was very curious about that. And I also was very curious about the way the story is written, because it's what I work in the Department of Sustainability and Resilience. And these kind of stories are called sci-fi or speculative prototyping storytelling, right? And they're used exactly for the purpose that you described. So I'm also curious if you're engaging with the genre of these types of scientific stories, but which are very speculative, they imaginative, but at the same time they're proposing futures that are very scary, or how to deal with the genre of these stories. Thank you.
Can I piggyback on that question? Because I have like a different formulation of the same kind of the same question about the role of literature in both cases. Because Christian, I think Christian can hear me, right?
Yes, we have microphones.
Yeah, I'm old, like I don't understand how technology works. But I was wondering, because one of your interlocutors, you mentioned Mediasur, you mentioned Moinham, you mentioned Brasier, and also one of the interlocutors is Reza Negarestani, who wrote Cyclonopedia, and then his last book is Intelligence and Spirit, which is a neo-Kantian positivist, neo-rationalist. So there seems to me to be a kind of pessimism with regards to what literature can do after the explorations of like 10 years ago, of it like a different way of engaging with language. And I don't see literature having the same impetus now, even though certain labels like speculative fiction are very much market friendly right now, right? But I wonder, like, what's the actual role of literature in this distribution of agency? But in that sense, thinking like in opposition to that, science fiction from the 40s, from the 50s, from the 30s even, was actually really influential in the way that we now think about possible futures and this kind of sci-fi prototypes. And if you think about like even the concept of a frontier, which is a very tricky concept, it's like it does resonate with space and the ocean as final frontiers in that sci-fi sense. And when you listen to Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk talk about their plans for the future, they are basically literally quoting sci-fi from the early 20th century. So how is that kind of also thinking about how temporality in relation to literature and action, how those work in terms of shaping what's possible now? And whether you think that maybe it's not a question of being pessimistic, but about it's a question of the belatedness of literature in like catching up with our imaginaries.
Could we add one more intervention to put on the table? I think I saw a hand raised there. Bundle one more. Yes, please. Thank you.
I do have kind of an intervention, and I guess like there is the idea of the frontier that we're bringing up, but I'm really struck by Matt's use of the word underworld, which I think is really interesting to think about in both like Christian's and in David's work. So I'm curious to hear, I guess, what is the role of the divine in all of this? You know, we're talking about the secular, we're talking about postmodern, we're talking about the post-human, but like, what of the divine? Of this idea that there is this world, and then there's an underworld, that there is this world, and then there's another. So.
I think we do have plenty now.
Yeah.
Do you want to start?
Yeah. I didn't hear very well. It was Romina, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I don't know, the sound wasn't great, but yeah, I'm gonna start just answering the question of Azucena. The first one, I think that I forgot, but the second one, in any case, I wanted to say that, yeah, the science, they are not including us. I mean, as I said, we are always a strong guest in this dinner or in this party. And that is the problem. This is why I'm just saying that we have to move on and just go to the ground and attack, to be in attack position, not always in the defense. It's kind of my point now. We are just to be more close to the anthropologists than other kind of humanities, social humanities now. I think that they are doing very well now, and they are in the first rank of the battle, and we have to join them. With Romina, I don't know if you want to ask me again, or because I can hear you very well.
Why don't we go maybe to David's answer, and maybe
Okay.
we can go back to you from that.
Yeah, and we might have to.
And I might have to step out because I have class, but you guys
we
keep
might
going.
have to wrap up soon. Maybe those of us who are in the room can move around and chat more. But yeah.
Okay, I was just saying to your question about energy, great, spot on. The major case study of my dissertation is an experiment with one of these ocean farms, which was designed to produce biofuels. And indeed, the US government has sunk $60 million back into this project to create these kelp farms, to turn the US exclusive economic zone into these kelp plantations, which would be used to power airplanes in a post-fossil world. So the sun is the ultimate sovereign, making a solar economy. These are absolutely central to the later projects. And so thank you for picking that up. Prototyping, STS, prototyping, what is the role of literature here? Joshua Landy has this great phrase, which I always think about in this question. He says, when I do it, I call it persuasion. When you do it, I call it rhetoric. And when they do it, I call it propaganda. And so he asks, okay, what does it mean to have a public sphere that is based on affect or based on emotional persuasion or aesthetics? Right? We know substituting aesthetics for politics has disastrous consequences. So, but okay. The concept of socio-technical imaginaries. This is something that doesn't come out in Jasnoff and Kim's idea. So I place it sort of in there. They say that these imaginaries do two things. They create a glue that is a common sense, right? And they also have this sense of like presenting a radical future that does work, that creates these breaks. And so the way I'm mostly thinking about it as literature is doing this glue work. It holds together the dreams when the funding isn't there to pursue these things. It operates on a longer time scale, and it has this way of becoming common sense. And then I flip it around and that it's all of the actors here, like you point out, have narratives. They have these visions of the future, which are necessary for building socio-technical systems. So there's always this work of narrative. Whether literature is the privileged space where that happens, this is an open question. Maybe you all can answer that better than I can, but I'm trying to bring it in as one piece. The divine, in my critique of socio-technical imaginaries, basically what I'm trying to say is that if we want to compose a common world, we need to think about a post-secular, post-human, or even decolonial way of thinking about imagination and imaginaries. I have stuff to say about Descola and the lessons from subaltern studies, but this is kind of a muddled answer. But yeah, I think there has to be room for this is at stake. Yeah.
Let me close our session and plant a thought. A connection between the two talks is labor and also with the gimmick. So per Cien Guy, what a gimmick is something that paradoxically seems to do too little work and also work too hard at something. And then when you drew that connection between ocean farming and plantations, my mind was, abuzz. I would foreground labor, because that's where the power comes in. And as you put it, David, the valence of thinking in terms of social that we call imaginaries, which we will continue to explore in materia throughout the year. I want to thank everyone for being here.
You guys can stay.
Yeah, I'm sorry for this.